This week, Mark Miller from the Retirement Revised podcast and newsletter, and I discuss a very compelling report from PBS NewsHour called Why Millions of Older Americans Are Retiring Early in the Wake of the Pandemic. Mark found it so compelling that he included it in his latest newsletter. When I watched the video, I thought this would be an excellent topic for discussion. Cue the music.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast, brought to you by Career Pivot. This podcast is where those of us in the second half of life come together to discuss how to repurpose our careers for the 21st century. Come listen to career experts give you proven strategies. Listen to people like you tell their stories on how they repurpose their careers. And finally, get your questions answered. Your host, Mark Miller, has made 6 career pivots over the last 30 years. He understands this is not about jumping out of the frying pan into a fire, but rather to create a plan where you make clear, actionable steps or pivots to a better future career. Are you ready to repurpose your career?
Welcome to episode 259 of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. My name is Mark Miller, and I'll be your host every Monday for discussion on what it's like to repurpose your career. This week, I interview Mark Miller, that is M-A-R-K Miller, of the Retirement Revised newsletter and podcast. Mark's a good friend and colleague and writes for the New York Times and many other outlets. I am a subscriber to Mark's newsletter and podcast. In his most recent newsletter, he included a PBS NewsHour segment, Why Millions of Older Americans Are Retiring Early in the Wake of the Pandemic. I will embed the video in the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-259. I found this a pretty compelling piece on why so many are retiring. But I'm concerned, will they be able to stay retired, or will they have to unretire? If they need to return to the workplace after 2, 3, or more years, what might that look like? We know when people go long-term unemployed, it gets tougher and tougher the longer they've been unemployed. I wanted to discuss this with someone who really understands this arena and could dig deeper into how this will affect those of us in the second half of life who are not retiring just yet. However, before we get to the episode, let's have a word from our sponsor, Career Pivot. The Career Pivot membership community continues to help the members who are participating in this project grow and thrive. This is a community where everyone is there to help everyone else out, figure out what they want to do in the second half of life, and then make it happen. Let's hear what Dean had to say about being part of the community.
First of all, you never know. There's always just a little push over the line to get you started, right? So when I first joined the community, the idea then was, I'm in this particular job and I don't want to stay at this particular job for the rest of my life. And so whatever that push needs to be, it still needs to be there. And I need to try to figure out what that is. I can remember we were, over the weeks that we've been doing community meetings, people saying, hey, look, I could listen to your book, or I think you would do good at doing voice work. So that encouragement, I think that's been good from the community, is just to be able to talk to people, hear their opinions. I know that, for example, we were talking about the first book I did, and I remember, Mark, you were like, well, some of the reading was a little monotone, and it was, but it didn't hurt my feelings. I mean, I agree with you, right? I mean, it was my first book. It is what it is, and things like that are good to have, I think, and I think if somebody's looking to be a part of the community, that's one of the things they can look forward to with this.
I am recruiting new members for the next cohort. If you are interested in learning more about the endeavor, go to careerpivot.com/community. Now, on to my discussion with the other Mark Miller. Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast. I have the real joy of having Mark Miller on the podcast from the Retirement Revised newsletter and podcast. And well, first, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Mark. Always good to chat with you.
In your last newsletter, you sent out a a video from PBS NewsHour about the great retirement. And I found that quite fascinating. And that's when I immediately reached out to you and said, let's have a discussion about it.
Yeah, the piece caught my eye too when I watched it this week. It was done by Paul Solomon, who's the economics correspondent for the NewsHour, and has done quite a bit of reporting over the years on issues related to older workers. So he's a pretty savvy guy on this stuff. And it, the piece sort of gave voice to a number of different, important issues and things that people are facing as they face the trade-offs of early retirement. Or, as he put, I think he's really talking about people who had basically no choice but to retire due to COVID. So it's a big, important topic. I've written about it a few times during the pandemic, and I'm thinking I'm probably going to return to it sometime soon because I think some interesting new questions are in play now.
I live in a retirement enclave here in Mexico, and it's like, starting about 3 months ago, someone turned the spigot on. During the pandemic, no one was coming down to visit. No one was looking around. Now it's just, we've been flooded with gringos. And it's in the past year or past 2 years, I usually, just about everybody who was American or Canadian, I recognized. Now I don't recognize anyone. What is driving this retirement?
Well, I think, what Paul focused on in his piece was the group of people who sort of had to retire due to worry about the risks of COVID. And there's been a lot of different research on this that points, you can find different sort of measures and statistics on how many people this affected, but suffice to say, it's a significant number. And I think there's also pretty strong evidence that just COVID sort of put the brakes at the sort of macroeconomic level on this trend of working longer. Not that there aren't people still doing that. There certainly are. In an economy this big, you can't overgeneralize, but the numbers are big enough that it's sort of at an aggregate level has sort of slowed that trend. And so, there is a few interesting questions there. I think one is, will some of these people go back to work? I think the answer to that is highly dependent on the path of the virus, how that plays out going forward. And as I think if we've seen, it's very, very tough to predict, right? And then you have all the usual questions that very well about, can you get back into the labor market and how easy or hard is that? And it's an interesting question now because you have all this information about labor shortages. So you would think that would increase opportunity for older workers. And that might be the case in some situations. But on the other hand, you got age discrimination, which hasn't stopped. So I think those are all kind of open questions. And then the other thing that occurs to me about all this is that, just what is the economic risk that people face with retiring earlier? And that was a topic before COVID. All the research for the longest time has indicated that about half of American workers wind up retiring earlier than they had planned to, either due to a health problem or a job loss or the need to become a caregiver, which is one of the themes in the NewsHour piece, or something else. It could be just burnout or just something that's harder to put your finger on, the need to move on, whatever. But COVID seems to have accelerated that. Now, what is the implication of that for people who are finding themselves retired earlier? Well, I think the answer kind of depends. I think if you're a middle income person who's going to retire mostly on Social Security, that's one kind of implication because you're probably going to file for Social Security younger than maybe you would have otherwise, which means you're going to accept a lower monthly benefit amount for life. So that's a set of implications. For people with more wealth, I think there's some other sorts of questions that come up. So again, one of the ideas that was explored in that NewsHour piece was people who felt liberated to retire because their stock portfolios are so, are up so much, which is undoubtedly the case. I mean, the markets have just continued to, defy gravity. And also the real estate market has been booming. So many people are feeling like, flush with greater amount of home equity, which also can be, leveraged to provide income in retirement in a variety of ways. So that's interesting. And I think, the stock market aspect of this, I think they quoted somebody in the piece last night saying, yeah, I don't have a financial planner, but I took a look at my portfolio and I'm just fine. And I started laughing and said, well, we'll see about that. Maybe you're fine and maybe not. Markets go up and markets go down. If you retire this year and the market plunges, you could have a problem. So there's that. And then home equity, you can't eat home equity. If you sell your home and pocket proceeds, you can use that to pay the bills. But so, unlocking home equity certainly can be done. And I think it's a smart consideration for people to think about, but it's not simple. So, and then you've got questions about how do you estimate your planned spending? People often make mistakes with that, or, just their projections are not right. Another interesting idea that came out in that NewsHour piece was that people have learned how to live on less during the pandemic because they can't go anywhere or do anything. And so now they're saying, hey, this isn't so bad. I can ratchet down my spending. But nonetheless, making a careful estimation of what your spending needs is always important. And then again, if you have portfolio assets, what's a safe drawdown rate? And there's all kinds of debate about that. The old rule of thumb used to be 4%, but I think most of the smart money these days is on something a little less than that just as a rule of thumb, more in the 3% range. So it's complicated when you're trying to figure out how to stretch savings and investments across a long retirement, what we hope will be a long retirement. And, actually it's an uncertain amount of time that you're trying to stretch it. Nobody really knows that answer. So, and if you're looking at financing more years now because you retired earlier, that becomes an additional challenge. So that's kind of right off the top, the things that occurred to me about this topic.
One of the things that concerned me, like the woman who was staying home to take care of her grandchild, said, look at my portfolio. And a number of years ago, I read a white paper on the fact that, when our parents, I know my father had a defined benefits pension plan where money went in, they managed the money. And when it was time to retire, they gave them a stream of income. When we went to a 401k IRA model where, number one, we had to manage the money. And for many people, that's not in their, it's not in their comfort zone. But even the harder piece is one I've focused on is how do I, now that I've got this chunk of money, how do I turn that into a stream of income?
Right. It's two different sets of challenges. One is the accumulation and the other is the decumulation. And they both come with challenges. The decumulation actually, in some respects, is more complicated since most of the 401k world has now migrated towards kind of automation and more simple choices, use of target date funds and index fund investing. Although I just published a column for Reuters this week about this question of complexity in retirement investing and in other systems that we have. I mean, one of my main themes at this point, having now covered the retirement beat for almost 15 years, is that we just have way too much complexity in our systems for most people to handle. The column was looking at a recent Supreme Court opinion in a case that was brought by employees at Northwestern University against the university, claiming that the university, as the plan sponsor, had not met its fiduciary responsibilities because it had too much complexity in its 401k plan, over 400 choices. And there were some other charges as well, but I just going to use that as a leap off point for a discussion of just this question of complexity. And I talked with, for the piece with John Reckenthaler, who is one of the research gurus at Morningstar. Now imagine this quote coming from somebody at Morningstar, which is all about, under the hood aspects of investing, and complexity is their game, right? But, John, I said to John, well, what would be the ideal length of a 401k menu in your view? And he said maybe six choices. You know, a target date fund, a couple other things, you're done. He says anything beyond that is just adding complexity, and the differences between the funds is not that great. And then he said, people don't mind browsing through hundreds of choices on their TV grid because people like TV. So complexity doesn't particularly bother them. But nobody really likes investing. And so people don't want to do it. You get analysis paralysis and all kinds of other bad behavioral impacts from that. So, simplicity. And you can find this throughout the retirement system. Like my favorite of example really is Medicare, where it's an incredibly complicated system to navigate correctly, and unnecessarily so, in my view. There's all kinds of reasons why it is that way, but I don't know how we got off onto that side tangent. But complexity is the enemy. I just finished a manuscript for a book that'll be coming out in January 2023 about retirement, and it's one of the themes of the books, trying to explain to people. The book is aimed at people who are getting close to retirement but are not financially prepared. And so it examines strategies you can put to work relatively late in the game to try to improve your outcomes. But I start out by sort of framing it with some of these issues. It's like, well, why are so many people unprepared? And it's like, folks, don't blame yourself, because here are the macroeconomics and here are the hurdles we have set up for you to have to navigate and jump through to have success. And one of the problems is complexity.
One of my things I got out of there was, the cavalier attitude about, well, I'm doing really well, so therefore I can retire. But the other piece is,
Could I jump in on that point before
Sure.
you go? I'm doing okay. I'm going to be fine. So, all these surveys that come out of surveying how people are feeling about retirement. And there's a bunch of this research out there. You poll people and they say, well, I'm doing fine. So all the doom and gloom about retirement is wrong, because actual retirees will tell you that they're doing fine. And the problem there is they're doing fine until they're not.
right.
Okay. And this is the fallacy in survey-driven, quote unquote, research, which isn't really research at all. It's just public opinion polling, but masquerading as research in many cases. Sure, you may think you're fine in those first few years of retirement until, a long-term care need comes up, or you find out that you messed up on your projections for drawing down, your portfolio is exhausted. Health emergencies, all kinds of things come up. Life happens. Sorry.
Or we have a bubble burst.
Yeah.
Like that hasn't happened in the last 20 years. And suddenly you have a big adjustment, and suddenly it's like, oh, well, I guess I can't.
Right.
And
or like 2008, 2009, when home values plummeted by half.
Right. Or, 2000, 2001 with the .com bust.
Right.
I will never forget standing on a soccer field in 1999 with one of the other parents who I've known very well for many years, and he was working for a major technology company. He says, well, I'm going to sell my Oracle stock this year because it's only going to double. And I went, oh my gosh, that's poor performance. Anyway, and one of my concerns is, okay, you decide to retire in your early 60s. And then, like you say, something says, okay, after 2 or 3 years, I need to go back to work. At least I need some income. And at that point, we all know that once with the long-term unemployed, once you've been unemployed for more than a year, it's really tough to get back in the job market. And the fact that the pandemic has disrupted so much stuff and has disrupted so many industries that, are you staying up to date? And the answer for most people will be no.
Right. And there's so much change going on in labor markets and employment markets. It's a very unstable moment, right? Lots of disruption and change. Companies don't even know where it's going. Are they going back to the office or not? Who knows? Nobody.
Quick interruption. If you are enjoying this podcast, please rate it and review it on whatever podcast player you are using. And more importantly, would you mind telling a friend? Thanks, and back to the podcast episode. Well, it's just like I'm updating. I have a career and industry disruption talk, and one of the things so many of the major restaurant chains have launched virtual brands. They're restaurants that have no locations, right? They're strictly pickup and delivery.
Right.
Or you have Amazon and Walmart and some regional chains like HEB who are building dark grocery stores that are delivery and pickup only. No one could have predicted that 2 years ago.
Right.
So if you leave the labor market now and you stay out for 2 or 3 years, getting back in would be really hard.
You would think. You would certainly think.
Well, I believe it'll be really hard, but also it's a matter of looking at employment in a different light.
Right.
Right.
But, I think one other thing about this phenomenon, and you can tell me if you agree or not, is that I think the people who could work remotely, I think, have come through it better than those who had to go into a job. And so there's implications there too, in terms of what part of the older workforce has been hit hardest by this. And, I think it's a fair assumption that it tends to be those who are lower income, not, Black and brown people. There's some evidence that women have been hit harder than men, but sort of more affluent white collar people who could sit in front of a computer and stay home have been less likely in the first place to be impacted by this. And in terms of adaptability, in the way you're just discussing, those are the folks that are most likely to be able to adapt.
Yes.
And they're already doing better. So it's a very unequal story.
It's very unequal. Like a couple of the discussions were the one woman who was a school teacher or a reading assistant, where she just said, "I'm done. This was just too stressful." Mm-hmm. I suspect we have a fair number of folks who retired because they didn't want to go into the office. I.e., for example, in the piece was the bus driver, the school bus driver, who said, there were like 50 of his grandkids, but it wasn't healthy for him to go sit in a bus.
Right. Right.
Versus, there are others that said, my life is just way too stressful.
Mm-hmm.
I'm done.
Right. I thought another interesting theme in that NewsHour piece that caught my eye was the gentleman who said, this crisis just made my wife and I sit up and take notice about what's important in life. And, we don't have forever. And how do we want to be spending our time? Sort of a values and a focus on mortality. That spoke to me because my last book, Jolt, Stories of Trauma and Transformation, was all about traumatic life events that make people stop and take stock and rethink. And that book was before COVID, but COVID arguably is a mass event trauma, right? And I just totally understood that idea, but as he articulated that, that makes total sense to me that COVID has really driven home that idea that nobody has forever. And so you have to really think carefully about how you want to spend your time. So, I think this is an important flip side of the coin on this whole discussion about working longer that often gets missed is time has value. And so if your decision is to retire early because that time has more value to you than working, then that's a good, it's a good deal. I mean, if you want to purchase time that way, you should go right ahead and do it, in my view, if you can pull it off. Because I write a lot about topics like Social Security and the value of working longer, I think oftentimes I have readers saying, well, you're always saying I have to work till 70 and wait till Social Security till 70. I say, no, I don't say that. I'm just laying out the math for you so you can understand the trade-offs on this side and that side. But I really think it's a very personal decision. Everybody has to work out for themselves. But the math of working longer, this is one of the things I explore and explain in this new book is undeniable. It's a very powerful leverage point if you're really worried about your security in retirement. Certainly one way to improve the odds is to work longer, delay Social Security, have more years to save, fewer net years that you'll be financing retirement. It's just unarguably a huge, huge leverage point. It's available. Hopefully it's available to people.
Yeah, one of the things I'm hoping that will come out of all this is people reevaluate what's really important.
I mean, that seems to be one of the ideas in this overall theme of great resignation and then the great retirement, as Paul Solomon put it, right? That's a big theme here, right?
Oh, very much so.
Rethinking how you want to where do you want to put your energies?
Well, it's the fact that we have a finite amount of time. How do you want to spend it?
Yeah.
As the one woman who's going to be taking care of her grandchild, that was more worthwhile than going into work. Right. And I'm seeing a lot of that, of people reevaluating how much they want to work. I mean, I'm doing that myself. I mean, I'm going, okay, how much do I don't want to stop working, but how much do I want to work? And then what makes me happy also drives how much income I need or how much I need to draw off my retirement nest egg. And it's forced a lot of people to think about, okay, what's important?
Right. Absolutely.
So do you think this trend will continue?
You mean of early retirement?
Yeah. I mean, I think the statistics I saw is somewhere around 2.5 million more than expected people retired. The question is, obviously, depending on the pandemic,
right?
Are we going to continue at that rate?
I think I honestly don't know. I think, like I said earlier, I do think the virus, the future path of the virus determines this in large measure, and we don't know that yet. If we're coming out of the woods on the pandemic, and if it becomes more endemic, I think you could reasonably expect a return to kind of the baseline we were at before, and probably a return towards a trend towards working longer, at least among some segments of the working population. Working longer has always been a white collar story.
Yeah.
It's not a factory floor worker story. Those are people who can't keep, lifting heavy stuff well into their 60s and the like. And it's very, very doable thing for white collar workers if they play their cards right, in terms of staying on top of their field and keeping skills up and all the rest, and being flexible and quick on their feet. If you're willing to have a flexible definition of work that doesn't necessarily mean a full-time job, it could be consulting or doing multiple things. You discuss this with your listeners all the time. So yeah, I really think of the story as the virus. It's that simple, and I can't forecast it any better than anybody else.
Well, John Tarnoff and I started the year off with our annual reality check, and we said, what will the end of the year look like? Probably a lot like it does the beginning of the year, in the fact that my prediction is things are going to stay unpredictable.
Yeah.
And as long as there's not a lot of certainty, companies will continue to they will continue to be reluctant to hire full-time employees, particularly older, higher paid ones. They will offer more contract work. One of my biggest concerns, I'm now on Medicare, which is but I know people who are in that 60 to 65 who see the huge spike. If they retire, they have to go through the ACA portals,
the exchanges.
Yeah. And that stuff is expensive.
Depends on basically your income bracket.
Right.
But yes, and it's it's a jolt, because if you are $1 over the line of those brackets.
Yes.
Man.
I know. I hit that. One year I had to completely give about $8,000 back in subsidies.
Yeah. Yeah. I shifted onto Medicare this year for the first time myself as well. And so I'd been on my wife's insurance plan. She's full-time employed at a university. And I decided it was time to eat the home cooking as a retiring journalist. And I was ready to make the move. And so it was a very interesting process. And, even as somebody who's done a lot of stories about Medicare, there were some twists and turns in the enrollment process that caught me by surprise. But generally speaking, it's gone pretty smoothly, I think.
Well, for me, neither my wife or I are eligible for anything other than Part A and B because we're outside the country. So,
right.
I wanted you on to discuss this because I think people looking at retiring early, I think they ought to be thinking about, okay, what if I need to go back to work? I have a lot of friends who are fully retired and I don't get it. I still need purpose in my life, whether I make money at it or not. So it's one of the things I'm curious. How do you encourage people not to say I'm going to retire, but I'm actually going to plan this out? And what is my day going to look like? And where am I going to get what's going to feed my passion? So I'm happy doing what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, it could be work for pay, and it could be activities you do that are not for pay, but that are satisfying and bring purpose and meaning, which, I think are critical to human happiness. So I always say to people that be thinking ahead and experimenting with things while you're still working, if possible, whether that's developing a side interest as a hobby or a volunteer activity or a side gig. If you're thinking entrepreneurially, don't hit the wall. Don't get to the day where you have retired formally and then go, now what? I think that's really a tough spot to be in. I think about this all the time myself personally, because I don't know exactly when I will retire. I mean, I'm an independent journalist, so I could just kind of step things down in pieces at some point. But I've got a lot of outside interests too. So I imagine that as I take the foot off the gas on the paid journalism work, other things will just sort of fill up those areas.
Yeah, I just worry about the people who just simply said, I got enough money, let's go retire.
Right.
Without having a plan.
Right. The standard line is, well, you can't play golf every day.
Yeah.
Although as a golfer, I sometimes say to myself, I think I probably could. But I'd also want to be doing my other more purposeful activities.
That's right. Well, I said where I live, the dog rescue place, the animal rescue places, the expat community here does a lot of volunteer work at food banks, and they give back to the community extensively. And that, and I know people who've come here and who have failed at retirement, and who gone back as realtors and found other work because they sucked at retirement.
Right. And even just going back to the math of this, a part-time job, some kind of gig, can be pretty meaningful in improving retirement security. Let's say you're able to earn enough to meet living expenses and push out that Social Security filing. That's a pretty good move for a lot of folks to be able to make. Okay.
Well, Mark, I know I just emailed you this morning and said, hey, can we talk about this? So I appreciate you coming on and doing a quick turnaround and talking about this.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's always an interesting topic, and it's always fun to speak with you.
So thank you very much for being on the Repurpose Your Career podcast.
Thanks, Mark.
I hope you enjoyed that episode. Mark has tremendous insights into the retirement arena. And even though I rarely discuss the topic on this podcast, it looks like a lot of folks our age will be pushed into retirement. You can find Mark at retirementrevised.com. Take a moment, go to careerpivot.com, sign up for the weekly Career Pivot Insights newsletter, which is sent out every Sunday. You will get weekly updates on this podcast, white papers, and new blog posts. While there, do not forget to check out the Career Pivot membership community, which can be found at careerpivot.com/community. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Look for Career Pivot on Facebook and LinkedIn. You'll also find me on Twitter at Career Pivot. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. You will find all the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-259. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Podbeam, Overcast, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and lots of other places where podcasts can be found. In fact, this podcast can be found on the Repurpose Your Career podcast channel on YouTube. Hope to see you next Monday for another episode of Repurpose Your Career podcast.